Welcome back to the Grease Goblins Reread channel. Today's video, we're going to be hitting Jon VI, A Clash of Kings. And I felt like I've been kind of saying throughout all of our rereads with Jon, it just feels like it's like building towards something, but it takes a long time to get going. And so we get a little bit of a focus of Jon here towards the end of the book, and I really think this is where it gets going. We have a lot more stakes. It's Jon, and he's not really with the Night's Watch anymore. He's in this small scouting party with Qhorin Halfhand. The tension's starting to build towards a conflict with the others, but also with the wildling plot that's kind of slowly been building up to this point. So with all of my criticisms of Jon in A Clash of Kings, I think this is by far his weakest book of the four he's a part of. I think this is where he starts to get going a little bit, and it really doesn't stop as we get into A Storm of Swords in the next book. So a really important chapter for us to talk about. I also think there's some really fun stuff that we get towards more the second half of the chapter that has insane foreshadowing with Jon's parentage, even some of the stories we've been told, and things to come. So that'll get us into page 553. The watchers in the Skirling Pass kept a fire burning high against the mountain, glowing like a fallen star, almost like the red comet that connects all of these chapters, all of these different POVs, especially earlier on in the book. Jon estimated it half a mile ahead and 2,000 feet up, positioned to observe the pass below. It kind of gives me another vibe like the Fist of the First Men, where it's this really strategic position where you can see pretty much everything around you, except for the fist. One side's not great, which we're going to see with the Battle of the Fist of the First Men in the next book. It also reminds me a lot of Weathertop of Lord of the Rings, if people know that. Weathertop is kind of like this great vantage point where you can see everything around you. Kind of reminds me of that as well here. Squire Dalbridge wondered aloud what Mance Rayder feared, noting the people on watch. Eben remarked that if Mance knew they had lit a fire, he'd flay them for it. And I want to talk about this right away. This is kind of I think the overconfidence or arrogance of the Night's Watch, just believing that they are completely superior to the wildlings, something we're going to see heavily contested as we go into the next book. But when you think about it from the other perspective, these people are being told to watch this area, but also the wildlings have much more knowledge into the others, how much of a threat that they actually are. So there's a reason as to why these people are watching this path, not only for spies like what Jon's party is, but also for the others to give some sort of alert before some attack like that could happen. Qhorin Halfhand observed that while fire was life in such cold, it could also mean death, which is why he forbade flames for his own men. Now, there's very much differences here. For Qhorin's party, he's trying to stealthily get to the wildling camp and either assassinate Mance or figure out what's going on, all that. So it's very imperative that they do not light a fire. But from the wildling perspective, there's no real reason to hide. Like, you know that people are going to be watching this pass. And so, yes, it might have been more of a surprise if they had climbed up this path. When they got to where the camp was, they didn't know the wildlings were actually there. Like, it could have gone differently, but when you think about the wildlings, they are more afraid of the others attacking them, not of the Night's Watch. And you even think about the Night's Watch are very much a lesser threat out here this far north in Westeros. Jon notes that they had only eaten cold salt beef, hard bread, and cheese, sleeping on cloth and piled under cloaks and furs, which reminded Jon of Winterfell nights with his brothers, because these men have to get close. You've got to do whatever you can to survive. And as of right now, you're not living the best, you're not sleeping the best, and you're having to just try and basically get warm any way that you possibly can. Stone Snake warned that the Watchers would surely have a horn. Qhorin stressed that it was a horn they must not be allowed to blow, as Eben looked at the distant spark and noted it would be a long and cruel climb by night. These men are all taking in that this is going to be a hard duty. Either one, you're going to be up here in the freezing cold, waiting for some other people to tell you that they've cleared the path, or it's going to be trying to make this climb in nighttime, where it's most cold, the most windy, terrible conditions. Imagine trying to climb up at below freezing conditions. It's not great. As we get into page 554, Qhorin judged the fire belonged to two watchers sharing the Skirling Pass, as Stone Snake, the best climber, volunteered to go up, and Jon Snow offered to join him as well. Qhorin agreed, but ordered Ghost stay behind as white fur showed too easily under moonlight. And also the climbing that they're going to have to go on, the way that Stone Snake takes them, you're not going to be able to bring a direwolf up. It's not going to be able to climb as the way they are going. So just in a lot of ways, it makes sense for them to stay. Another thing we have to think about here for Jon is very similar to how a lot of the men were at the Fist. They would rather be doing something than just waiting around for action to happen or to go to war against the others, the wildlings or whatever. This is a lot of the reason of why Jon went. Jon wanted to do something. He didn't like sitting around. And so he's going out and he's doing this mission for a lot of those reasons. He, in a lot of ways, is still kind of playing the boy. Yes, Jon is courageous, but he almost has a confidence to him that's going to be kind of stripped away as we see him join the wildlings and really the severity of his mission and even having to kill Qhorin Halfhand. Stone Snake and Jon each took a rope, and Stone Snake also carried spikes and a muffled hammer. They left their garrons, armor, helms, and Ghost in the hollow with the others. Jon said farewell to Ghost, commanding him to stay. And that's another part of it. You're making a climb like this, you can't take armor with you, it'd be too heavy, it's going to weigh you down, it's going to make you less agile. You need to be nimble, and you need to be able to basically save your strength for the climb. Something that Jon is going to kind of find out later on in the next book. Stone Snake led the climb, short, wiry, gray-bearded, strong, and sharp-eyed, even in the dark. You really get a presence of, this is an experienced man. You know, he's seen a lot of winters, he's experienced in this kind of stuff. This isn't going to faze him. But for someone like Jon, making this nighttime climb in harsh conditions, it's going to open up his eyes a little bit. The mountains by night were black against the pale crowns of ice and snow with moonlight on them. What's great for the watch is because they dress in black, at nighttime, it's not going to be the easiest to see them. They ascended slowly along a twisting trail, breathing frost, careful on the uneven rocks. The Skirling Pass wound up and down through peaks and hidden valleys, harsh and lifeless. The frost fangs were cruel and hostile to men. The winds cut like knives, shrieking through the heights. Few twisted, stunted trees grew there, and jagged rock shelves jutted with icicles like teeth. You really get the idea that this is not a place that you would want to live, but it also brings up even a different question is, why did Mance Rayder bring his entire civilization to really the edge of nowhere, and it's freezing conditions, you're not going to be able to survive off this for long? Why did he do it? And that's going to be the whole mystery of both this book and the next book, and that's the point. But as of right now, Jon, Qhorin, they don't understand what is actually going on here. They have a vague idea that Mance is looking for some magical thing, but they don't necessarily know for what. But that consists of page 555. Jon was struck by the beauty of the frost fangs despite their cruelty. Waterfalls flashing in sunlight, meadows with autumn wildflowers, dizzying ravines, natural stone bridges, soaring eagles, and a shadow cat hunting a ram. Even though the conditions might be not the best at all, there are still beauties. Nature has a lot of beauty, and that's something that as I've grown up and I've gotten older, I've really come to appreciate. I've really enjoyed doing photography out in nature. Now, it's a whole different story, but I have taken this camera that I'm recording on into nature, and one of those hikes did not end well. So that's all I'll say on that. He compared himself to the shadow cat, hoping to strike silently and quickly. He carried Longclaw, though space might be too tight for it, and also a dirk and dagger. Jon is prepared. Jon knows if he has to, in a very quick pinch, get his dagger and his dirk out, he will. He isn't reliant on Longclaw, but he will use it if he gets the chance. The real question that I find so interesting for Jon is when you think about Jon, this is the first time he's really going to be in an actual fight where somebody else is trying to kill him and he is trying to kill them. It comes not in an honorable sense. It's not like a one-on-one fight where both are prepared. It's not, what the fairy tales tell you. It's not anything like that. Jon's first killing, more or less, is going to be like an assassination. It's very dishonorable. Very interesting the way that George kind of does that little twist on it, right? Because we're always hearing about how violence is not good in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's a main theme. It's interesting the way Jon is going to have to basically kill his first person, unless you want to count really the other that he killed. But I would say this is his first true, he's going to kill someone. The Black brothers followed the fire's glow as they climbed steadily higher along a twisting trail. In places, Jon had to flatten himself against the mountain an inch sideways. The path was cracked, rubble-strewn, icy, and treacherous. He reminded himself, one step and then the other, and I will not fall. Again, really tough conditions. At this point, these are trails that aren't often used because people don't really live here all that much. and Jon is having to try and adjust to the conditions. Frost stiffened his lip hairs after days without shaving. The wind rose fiercely, forcing him to cling to the rock until it passed. One thing I'll say, the fact that Jon is growing facial hair at this young of an age is actually kind of crazy. So I guess good on you, Jon. I don't remember having facial hair problems like I needed to shave until I was like 17 or 18 maybe. So, good up on you, Jon, I guess, on getting facial hair. Looking down meant endless blackness above only moon and stars. Stone Snake had once told him, "The mountain is your mother. Cling to her, press your face up against her teats, and she won't drop you." Interesting, though, because Jon's response is going to be very fascinating. Because one thing I'm going to talk about a lot, especially when we get to Ygritte's story that she's going to tell Jon, this chapter has a weird emphasis on things that you can relate to Jon's past. And I mean that from both sides. If you're going from Ned and Ashara point of view, if you're going from Lyanna and Rhaegar point of view, there's a lot here that's really interesting. But Jon had made a joke out of this. This is something that maybe Jon would never have done in book 1, but he seemed to grow a little bit more acceptable of what his mother probably was or who his mother is. Jon had once joked about never knowing his mother until finding her in the Frostfangs, but now the jest felt hollow. He clung tight, step after step, as we get into page 556. The narrow track ended where a massive shoulder of black granite jutted out, creating deep shadow. The Stone Snake prepared for the climb, tying Jon to him with rope and starting upward quickly. Jon followed much slower, watching carefully how Stone Snake found handholds. We really get to see that Stone Snake is really living up to that kind of name. He is able to traverse this relatively easy. Like, he doesn't seem like he's having any issues, whereas Jon, he's battling his emotions, he's also battling the cold, the conditions, and he's struggling. At each stopping point, Stone Snake either looped the rope around natural rock or hammered in iron spikes with a felt-headed hammer, the sound echoing despite his care. Jon reminded himself, cling to the mountain, keep weight above your feet, never look down. What I think is really interesting is Jon really thinks about how is nobody hearing this, even though the Stone Snake is taking a lot of cautions with the way he's hammering in these little, spots that he can loop the rope on. When you're up, this high and it's echoing, you would assume like maybe people would hear it, but you got to also remember, think about how harsh the wind is. You also got to remember they're on the other side of the mountain. Like they're not directly like in this place where the wildlings are. They're like on the outside trying to like look over down on them. So it's different the way sound travels and also interpreting, because you're living out here in the Frostfangs more or less in this pass. You're not going to get spooked by every sound. It could be a shadow cat, it could be whatever. But Jon's foot had slipped, but he managed to hold on. He climbed without gloves to keep his grip despite the cold seeping into his fingers, as the Stone Snake had kind of not instructed him to do so, but Jon is seeing, if he's doing it, maybe I should as well, which makes sense. If you've ever tried to maybe throw a football outside, or you've tried to handle anything outside when you have gloves on and it's snowing, just think about it like that. Like, you can't really spiral a football that well with like looser gloves. Like, of course, for like the NFL, they have gloves that are very tight that allow you to do that kind of stuff. But even in this situation where it's like you're holding on icy rocks and stuff like that, your hand is going to be more reliable than a glove is going to be, even if that means you maybe get frostbite or whatever. At least you're not falling off the cliff. His burned hand grew stiff and painful, and he tore open his thumbnail at some point, smearing blood on the rock every time that he put his hand somewhere. They climbed higher and higher, shadows creeping over the moonlit wall. From below, anyone could have seen them, but the mountain kept them hidden from the wildlings by the fire. Jon felt they were close, yet instead of thinking about the foe above, he thought of Bran, who had loved to climb. He wished he had a fraction of his brother's courage. Interesting, given the fact that we just know that Bran has been killed off the page, but not really. Interesting the way that gets brought up here, and it also goes to point to the idea of Bran was such a sure climber. He was always very brave on it. Just kind of pointing to the idea that Bran didn't fall, as we get into page 557. Jon and Stone Snake climbed into a fissure of icy stone 2/3 up the wall, then crawled along a narrow shelf until they saw the orange glow of the wildling fire. The fire was set in a shallow depression at the narrowest part of the pass, with a sheer drop below and rock behind for shelter. It's a great place to camp, right? Just given the fact that you can only be assaulted from really a couple spots, but you also got to remember, the Night's Watch are putting their lives at risk scaling a mountain because they desperately need to have secrecy. So really, if you're the wildlings, you're only really watching from like one direction from which people are coming to. And also it is hiding you from the wind. It's helping you to be able to just live because this is your position. You're staying out here in the middle of the conditions like night after night. Crawling on their bellies, the brothers got close enough to see 3 wildlings, one asleep under furs, one sitting by the fire complaining, and one watching the pass with a horn. Jon realized there were 3, not 2 as expected, but knew the task remained the same. It gave him a little bit of pause, and also something to point out here is Jon believed that the person sleeping, who is Ygritte, was actually a man. He doesn't actually figure out that this is a woman at this point. That's something that's going to come up and shock him as the fight begins, more or less. But they're kind of realizing they're going to get the leap on these men. But for Jon, there's a little bit of doubt there because Jon now realizes he needs to kill one of these people very quickly because they're outnumbered. It's a 2 against 3, but they have the surprise. Stone Snake pointed to the hornblower as Jon chose the man by the fire as his target. Stone Snake leapt first, scattering pebbles, and Jon followed with long claw drawn. The horn bearer went for his horn, but Snow Snake knocked it aside before it could sound. But this is what's so interesting. So Jon specifically thinks about how this man was brave. He went for his horn instead of going for a weapon or trying to survive. He went for the horn first. Remember what we talked about in the last Theon chapter? How we talked about this man and how he couldn't blow the horn because of the wolves killing him. It's so interesting because George always does this and he places his chapters so well, is that this chapter connects a lot with both the last chapter with Theon and then also with the last Daenerys chapter in the House of the Undying. It connects a lot with the symbolism of flowers and that probably representing Lyanna and then also Jon at the Wall. It's really interesting the way that that's then called back in the next chapter there with Jon and how he reflects on this person being very brave, in which cost him his life going for the horn instead of going for a weapon. Jon's foe attacked with a burning brand, nearly striking him with fire, but the sleeper at this point starts to stir as Jon fought, so he struck quickly with Longclaw, cutting through his enemy. The dying wildling twisted, ripping Longclaw from Jon's hands as Jon drew his dirk and grabbed the newly awakened sleeper, jamming the knife under their chin. As he did, he realized with shock that the wildling was a girl. And it goes to paint the idea that Jon's first kill is even more dishonorable given the fact that Jon had a sword, a Valyrian steel sword. The wildling that he was fighting was also unaware and didn't even have really a weapon out at all. It just paints that idea that's so interesting of the idea of chivalry and all that kind of stuff. It's so great the way George does that. And then the next person that Jon finds is actually a woman or a girl, more or less. She's a little older than he is. Ygritte's a couple years older than Jon. But still, as I get this into page 558, it puts Jon in a tough spot. Stone Snake urged Jon to kill the girl, calling her a wildling watcher, but Jon hesitated. This is a different scenario now. Ygritte isn't fighting back. It's also a girl. Girls are not supposed to be killed by, chivalrous knights and all that kind of stuff. It goes against everything that Jon has ever known. So what does he do? And that's the issue that he sees. He saw her fear and thought of Arya, realizing she was no older than himself, which is wrong, right? We actually know that Ygritte's a couple years older than him, but still, it's the same fact, more or less. Instead of striking, Jon asked if she would yield. Ygritte answered, "I yield." So Jon declared her as captive and pulled the dirk away. But Stone Snake reminded him Qhorin had said nothing of taking captives, but Jon argued he'd said nothing against it either. It's really just Jon trying to prevent having to do a very dishonorable act of, one, killing an unarmed person that is also a woman. It's why we love Jon. And you got to think about it from this point of view, though. The opposite is, well, she is still a wildling. If you let her go, she's going to inform other wildlings of your presence. If you don't kill her, there's a lot of bad that can come from it. And so it's a lot of the idea of like, it's either me or you kind of situation. And that's what a lot of these people are going to be feeling. But Jon is just, he's been brought up to be this honorable person. And he's not willing to just instantly kill someone just because it's me or you type situation. So that's the interesting part of this chapter and what I really find so awesome, especially because it also introduces Ygritte and Jon, which is going to be a fascinating relationship as we move into A Storm of Swords. Stone Snake pointed out she was a spear wife and would kill given the chance, but Jon kicked her axe away and asked her name. She said Ygritte, rubbing blood from her throat. Jon gave his own name and she flinched, calling it an evil name. Jon clarified it was a bastard name, saying he was the son of Lord Eddard Stark. I really love the reaction Ygritte gives to Jon's name. Jon Snow. And what do the wildlings equivalate Snow with? The others, the thing that they fear way more than, say, the Night's Watch. That's why it's an evil name. And is there some foreshadowing to something we'll see with Jon later on? Maybe some compromise he'll have to make with the others or something along that idea. Are the Starks and the others related somehow? A lot of interesting questions come up from one simple line, if this is meant to be more than what it is. Stone Snake mocked the situation, noting captives are supposed to give information, though wildlings often die before betraying secrets. And that's the issue, is Jon is treating Ygritte like a person. He's getting to know her more, they're interacting, and it's going to be even harder to actually kill her. It's the same idea, for instance, if you've watched Breaking Bad. We're doing a lot of references to other stuff today, but I think a great example is in the first season of Breaking Bad. This is very much spoilers, where Walter White has to kill Crazy Eight. And the thing that makes it much harder for Walt to do that is Walter is getting a better, understanding of who he is. And so it's not just like a nameless person that tried to attack you or anything like that. You're now making them a person. You're actually killing them, and this is something that you've come to know. That's the issue that Jon is going to run into with Ygritte specifically. Stone Snake threw a burning brand into the pass as a signal for Qhorin's party, but Ygritte insisted they should burn the dead wildlings. We know why Ygritte is insisting this, not really because of she's trying to signal it to other wildlings, but maybe that's a part of it. But she knows that the others are the real threat, and if they don't want them coming back, they better deal with it. Stone Snake refused, saying a larger fire would draw attention, but her stubborn warning implied that they might need their swords again if the bodies weren't burned. Again, referencing the whole idea with the others, just building the threat for the Fist of the First Men in the next book. As we get into page 559. Stone Snake stripped one of the dead wildlings of all of their possessions and then threw them off the cliff. And then Jon followed suit, realizing what he was doing, just getting the bodies away from them. So even if they did come back, they really wouldn't have to come back and have any issue with the Night's Watch. Ygritte silently watched, and Jon realized she was older than her first thought, perhaps 20, short and bandy-legged with red hair, a round face, and crooked teeth. Jon questioned Ygritte. She admitted she was sent to watch for the crows, saying, "You and others." Now, this is not meant to imply just the Night's Watch. I think she was looking more specifically for the others as well, but of course, that's what she was sent to do. Stone Snake asked what waited beyond the pass, and Ygritte answered the freefall, claiming hundreds and thousands, more than you ever saw. When pressed about their purpose in the Frostfangs, Ygritte refused to answer, turning away. Ygritte is not willing to betray Mance and the other wildlings at this point. She's willing to say, oh, there's a ton of them because it's going to make them very fearful. But Ygritte is a wildling at heart. She isn't going to betray them to the Night's Watch, even if her life is at risk. Something that's very interesting and what I think really ties Jon and Ygritte together is in a lot of ways they're very similar. Jon's the exact same way. Jon is not really willing to betray the, Night's Watch, even when it comes to loving Ygritte and, abandoning her, all that kind of stuff. Jon and Ygritte are very similar in a lot of ways when it comes to their loyalties. Jon asked if they planned to march on the wall and if she knew anything about his uncle Benjen Stark, but she ignored him. She wasn't willing to give him any information. Stone Snake warned Jon she might bite off her tongue before speaking. At this, a shadow cat's growl echoed through the mountains, followed by another closer sound as Jon drew his sword. Ygritte reassured him that the cats would not trouble them, saying they were drawn by the dead, able to smell blood from 6 miles away. She said they would feed on the bodies until nothing remained. That is the dark part of it, is these people's remains were just thrown down to the shadow cats, and I guess that's the circle of life, but it's got to be a bad way to go. That's all I'll say. I know that they're dead, but still, your remains being eaten by shadow cats is not a great thing anyway. It also shows, though, how Ygritte is very experienced, especially in terms of living north of the wall, something that Jon has really no idea of, all that kind of stuff. Jon listened to the echoes of feeding and felt uneasy. Though bone-tired, he dared not sleep. He had taken a captive, and it was his responsibility to guard her, and that is the truth. Jon cannot sleep while, his hostage could kill him, run away, do any of that stuff, so Jon had to stay up. And the other part of this is, could you imagine this? Like, you're just uneasily at this camp of which you just killed 2 people. You throw down their, more or less their naked bodies down off this cliff, and you're hearing cats eat them. Very unsettling. As we get into page 560, Jon asked Ygritte if the slain wildlings were her kin, but she replied, "No more than you are," then pointed out that Jon had named himself the bastard of Winterfell. This is where we're going to get into a great story that has so much symbolism, in my opinion, and we're going to talk about the possibility of the wildlings and the Starks being intermingled in their blood. But once again, we get to the idea of who is Jon's mother, as Ygritte asks him bluntly. Jon admits he never knew her, and she asked if his mother had sung him the song of the winter rose. Now, what does that instantly, make you think about? Makes you think about Lyanna and her, rose, or her blue flowers she used to love. We talked about it a ton in the House of the Undying chapter, and now it's brought up again. Jon said he never knew such a song. Ygritte explained it was made by Bael the Bard, king beyond the wall long ago, whose songs all the free folk knew. And it's so interesting because this is also like a prelude to Mance. We know Mance's plotline will be very similar to this, and really the Winds of Winter, and also Dance with Dragons, as he comes in and he sneaks into the Bolton camp, and he's, his women anyway, or spear wives, are interacting with Theon, trying to get fake Arya out of the castle. There's a lot of stuff here that's very interesting because almost every line of this can be interpreted in multiple different ways. Jon objected that Winterfell was not in the south. Ygritte countered that to free folk, everything south of the wall is south. And that's how I would be. And this is something Jon's going to figure out, especially as he interacts more with the wildlings. But you got to be thinking, if you're somebody that lives north of the wall is basically the end of the world. That's more or less how I would look at it. Is that you cannot go any further south than this. So anyone south of that, those are the Southerners. We're cut off from the rest of the world. Jon reflected that it was all about perspective, which Ygritte agreed with, something that's going to get very interesting. I keep saying this so much because I think this chapter does such a great job of introducing the main plot for A Storm of Swords that I really rank this chapter very highly. It's not a crazy chapter, like it's Jon sneaking up on, 3 wildlings and killing, one, and then Stone Snake killing another one. But it's this story. It's the symbolism that George is kind of putting there to just introduce the story that's going to be told for the next book. He asked her to tell him the story just to keep him awake while they waited for Qhorin, who would not arrive for hours. Ygritte teased him as a brave black crow, but began her tale of Bael. Before he was king beyond the wall, Bael was a famed raider. Snowstake dismissed him as a murderer, robber, and a sexual assaulter, we'll just say. Ygritte replied that it depended on where you were standing. And that's the interesting part is, even when we think about just a simple song, it has many interpretations, and that's the way that we look at so many different things. Think about if you were to go from the United States, go to another country, go to Japan, go to China, go to wherever, the way that they look at certain historical events might be completely different. And that's what's great about this song is it builds the idea that the wildlings and the Night's Watch, they're not all that dissimilar, or people south of the wall and the wildlings, they're not all that dissimilar. It's just the situations that they've been put into. Ygritte continues her story, saying, "A Stark in Winterfell once called Bael a coward for only preying on the weak. Bael then vowed to teach him a lesson, climbing the wall and entered Winterfell disguised as Sigeric of Skagos." I didn't say that right at all. What does this also remind you of? It also reminds you of, Mance snuck into Winterfell during the opening to a Game of Thrones, with Robert coming to Winterfell, all that kind of stuff. It reminds you of that as well. A lot of the symbolism from this story can also be represented in a character like Mance. Bael carried a harp and singers were always welcome. He dined at Lord Stark's table and played old and new songs so well that the Lord offered him a reward, not too dissimilar to what we see kind of with the Boltons later on. Bael asked only for a flower, the fairest flowers that bloom in the gardens of Winterfell. Now think about this, if we apply this to the story, Rhaegar and Lyanna. Lyanna represents the flower of Winterfell. And the way that she's represented by Ned in these dreams that we get in the House of the Undying, she's represented as a blue flower, more or less. And so here you have Bael plucking that. It's meant to represent Rhaegar capturing and or taking Lyanna. That's the way I look at it personally. And I think it's even more interesting because you think about how there's different interpretations of this actual story. Same idea applies with Rhaegar and Lyanna. That's the idea that some people believe that Rhaegar kidnapped Lyanna, but some people might believe that it was Rhaegar and Lyanna were in love. That kind of idea. So there's different interpretations very similar to this tale of Bael the Bard. As we get into page 561, Ygritte told Jon that when the winter roses bloomed, Lord Stark sent to the glass gardens and plucked the most beautiful rose as Bael's reward. By morning, both Bael and Lord Brandon's maiden daughter had vanished. In her bed was left only a pale blue rose. It kind of also would be the idea of like, so Lyanna and Rhaegar, they run away. But by the time that Ned finds her again, she's basically going to die. And all that she's going to be left with is a baby in Jon. That's the way I interpret this. And this idea that Rhaegar and Lyanna, they go off, Lyanna then dies, and Jon is what remains. I really love the symbolism. If R+L is the true theory, it just fits into this story really nicely. Jon objected, asking which Brandon this was meant to be, since none fit the tale. Ygritte sharply said it was Brandon the Daughterless, and asked if he wanted to hear the tale or not. This is the other point that I think is really important, is that we don't actually know if this tale is true, and likely it's a fabrication of multiple different tales, maybe smushed into one. That's how stuff like this forms. But the other part of this is when you think about the idea of nicknames. So we're going to think about how the Starks remember their former lords or kings. So Brandon the Shipwright. That name would not have the same name as in with the Free Folk. So could one of these Brandons maybe have been this person? We don't really know. Lord Brandon sent out hundreds of black crows to find his daughter, but for nearly a year they searched in vain. On his deathbed, Brandon heard a child's cry and discovered his daughter back in her chamber with a babe at her breast. I very much think this is going to be like the idea of Ned finding Lyanna at the Tower of Joy and having Jon be like that heir, more or less. Ygritte explained that Bael and the girl had been hiding all along beneath Winterfell in the crypts with the dead. So great. The writing here is so great by George, because this is like a subtle foreshadowing to like, yeah, Bran and Rickon, they're still alive, they're fine, but they're in the crypts, and this is a place where almost no one would look for them. The maid loved Bael so dearly, she bore him a son who later became Lord Stark. Is this foreshadowing to possibly Jon becoming Lord Stark? Maybe, who knows? Ygritte told Jon that this meant he too had Bael's blood, same as her. And this would be very interesting if it is the case. We just don't really know. Jon rejected the story, saying that it never happened. Ygritte shrugged and said it might be true or false, but it was still a good song, one her mother sang to her. And that's the point. Songs are songs. They're not always true. A lot of times they're, played up to be a good song. That doesn't mean it's always true. But Ygritte added a darker ending. 30 years later, Bael became king beyond the wall and led the free folk south. At the frozen ford, Bael faced young Lord Stark, his own son, and he could not harm him. The son killed Bael instead, unknowingly committing to being a kinslayer. Ygritte ended by saying the gods hate kinslayers even when they kill unknowing. Now, this is another thing that's fascinating. Given the fact that I talked about in, last week's video, the idea that Theon might actually be a kinslayer, that he actually killed his own children that he had with this, Miller's wife that we know he had sex with, could that be that is also a reference to Theon being a kinslayer? It's really possible. We don't know. As we get into page 562. Ygritte finished her tale, saying that when Lord Stark returned from battle with Bael's head on his spear, the girl's mother leapt from a tower in grief. And this is the part I brought up about why you can interpret this in so many different ways. Because say you're a Ned and a Ashara fan, you could also interpret this as being, well, Jon's mother, Ashara, allegedly killed herself in this same manner. Very on the nose. What's so great is that this Bael's story that Ygritte tells has so many different interpretations that you could foreshadow to other moments in the series, but we haven't really figured all of that out yet. And it's just a nice part of this chapter that I really enjoy. This is probably my favorite part of Jon's story of the entire book, probably. I mean, you're maybe this with a couple of moments from the next chapter and then maybe the fist, but I really love this moment for Jon in the book. Her son did not long live after her. One of his own lords flayed him and wore his skin as a cloak. More foreshadowing to the Boltons. This chapter's great. In terms of foreshadowing, it's fantastic. Jon then told her that Bael was a liar, but Ygritte insisted Abard's truth was different from others. She reminded him that he had asked for the story. She turned away, closed her eyes, and seemed to sleep. At dawn, Qhorin Halfhand and the other rangers arrived as Stone Snake spotted them below. Jon woke Ygritte and held her by the arm as they descended to meet the others. There was another easier path down the mountain, and they waited there as the rangers came with their garrons. Ghost raced ahead, playing with Jon by tugging at his wrist, but Jon noticed Ygritte staring wide-eyed at the direwolf. Of course, she hasn't seen a wolf this big, and direwolves are said to be much bigger than regular wolves. Qhorin made no remark about the captive, as Stone Snake only said there were 3, and Edmund mentioned they had passed what the shadow cats had left of the other 2. And it's really interesting if you think about it from the men's perspective, like what actually happened. Why are there 2 random men thrown off the cliff or whatever? And also, I think another thing going back to Ygritte that I kind of thought about as I was going on is also Ygritte figuring out that Jon probably is a warg. That's why he's able to actually have a pet direwolf. Jon then spoke up, insisting that Ygritte had yielded to him, but Qhorin asked Ygritte what she would expect if he yielded to her people. She replied, a slower death than elsewise, and that is the truth. Qhorin would be tortured, all this stuff. It wouldn't be a clean, quick death, and it's a little bit to represent why that Jon should kill Ygritte. But at the same idea, Ygritte is very innocent at this point. Ygritte hasn't actually done anything to them. She was taken as a prisoner, all that kind of stuff. It's a moral gray line here. You know why Jon is being kind of pushed to kill Ygritte, but at the same time, you know why he shouldn't. So it's a really interesting point that I really enjoy. Qhorin then turned to Jon, pointing out they have no food to spare, nor men to guard her. As Squire Dalbridge and Evan both warned the girl was a danger, Evan drew his dagger, suggesting death would silence her. It was the only way that these men believed that they could go for. Jon protested that she had yielded, but Qhorin told him, then you must do what needs be done. You are the blood of Winterfell and a man of the Night's Watch. He ordered the others to leave Jon to it, saying it would be easier for him if they did not watch, and led him up the trail toward the rising sun. And we know that Qhorin, based on the next chapter, didn't actually think that Jon was going to kill her or any of that stuff, but he was kind of testing Jon in a lot of ways to see what kind of a man that he was. It's right there in the phrasing. You must do what needs be done. You are the blood of Winterfell, but all that stuff. It's right there. He's not necessarily telling Jon to kill her, but he is interested to see what Jon will do, even though he kind of already knows. As we get into page 563, Qhorin Halfhand led the rangers up the trail toward the sunrise, leaving Jon and Ghost alone with Ygritte. Jon thought she might run, but she only stood and waited, watching him. Ygritte is brave. She's not willing to flee or any of that kind of stuff. She's like Jon in a lot of ways, and she's not going to balk from this. If this is where she dies, it's where she dies. She asked if he had ever killed a woman before. When he shook his head, she told him women die the same as men, and suggested he didn't need to kill her. And this is the other part of it, is that Ygritte is also going to try and turn Jon to being with the free folk. She recognizes that. Now, I think there's a little biased on Ygritte's point of view, especially because Jon probably she finds attractive. Well, we know she finds him attractive. And also she is kind of seeing that indecision in him, right? What the Night's Watch is telling Jon is not what Jon wants to do. So Ygritte thinks that she can use that and turn him to being into a free folk person. This is great because it's going to give Jon an out to become part of the free folk and spy on them and then betray them. But at the same time, it's Ygritte is willing to try and rationalize her way out of death rather than flee and die running away. She's not going to do that kind of stuff either. Ygritte suggests that Mance would take him in and there were secret ways the Watch would never find. Jon replied that he was as much as a crow as the rest. But Ygritte kind of sees that there is that indecision, right? There is something there. But at this, Ygritte resigned. She accepts her fate and asks if he would burn her after death, but Jon said he couldn't. The smoke might be seen. She accepted that, saying a Shadowcat's belly wasn't the worst place to end up. Of course, she's referencing coming back as an other, a white, whatever. I agree, but at the same time, it's a grim fate. He readied Longclaw and asked if she was afraid. Ygritte admitted she had been the night before, but not now with the sun up. She bared her neck and knelt, urging him to strike quickly. Jon lifted Longclaw, preparing for one clean cut, reminding himself he was his father's son. But when the moment came, He could not strike. Ygritte pressed him, calling him a bastard and saying she could not stay brave forever. When he still did not swing, she turned to look at him. Ygritte is kind of getting frustrated by this as well. Like, it's one thing to, put on a brave face and all that stuff, but then when it's like you're just waiting, you're waiting, even if it feels like a couple seconds, those could feel like hours for your life to end and the great unknown of what comes after death, if anything comes after death. That's what Ygritte is kind of feeling. And so Jon just not doing anything is putting her more at edge than, him actually just killing her. Jon lowered his sword and told her to go before his wits returned. Ygritte stared at him, then left. This is kind of that moment where if you're Ygritte, you recognize that Jon is not fully indoctrinated into the Night's Watch, especially given how young he is, because he's willing to, in his own eyes, right? Like Jon believes that he is disobeying an order. Ygritte's going to see that, and so that's going to come up later on in the story. But for Jon, we totally get why he doesn't do this. This is killing somebody that's innocent, that is submitted to you, and you're having to kill them. And it's so interesting because Jon questions, is he his father's son? He's trying to hype himself up to do it, what Ned would do, killing the deserter, all that kind of stuff. But he isn't able to go through with it. And it might even be a simple nod to like, oh, well, Ned isn't your actual father, Jon. It's actually somebody else. Maybe it's a little nod to that. I don't know. Maybe I'm reaching on that one. But again, I think this is Jon's, if not his best chapter of the book. As far as what we've covered in this reread, it's by far his best one. It has the most that's great about the rest of the story, connecting it to multiple other points happening, whether it be Theon or Daenerys and or Bran's chapters, I should say. It's a great chapter for Jon. And I would say like this is the beginning of some of the peak Jon chapters, especially because of the wildling stuff, especially because of Ygritte, all that kind of stuff. So I hope you guys all enjoyed. I hope you guys are ready as we're starting to now get into the best parts of Jon as we even get into A Storm of Swords. And I hope you guys all enjoy. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, guys.